How do we learn? Or better put, how do we learn best? Well, I'd like to start with research at Harvard University with first-year science students in an introductory physics course, and they compared how we learn and how we learn best with this familiar scenario on the left. So there were two study conditions, and in those conditions, it was a standard lecture by someone who was really well versed in the subject matter, also really well trained in terms of how to deliver some complex information to students who were new to the subject, science students, but still new to this subject. So in both conditions, we had a standard lecture, and the students had a worksheet that they completed, and the only difference was when they came to solve a problem. In the scenario on the left, the students listened to the lecturer explain how to solve the problem, again, very, very clearly, and they took notes and they had the solution at the end on paper to take with them. And what they toggled on and off was this active learning element for the other group. And what they did when it came time to solve the problem was they got into small groups and worked together to solve the problem with the instructor circulating to help them as needed. At the end of all of the classes, the students were tested on their learning, but also asked about their feeling of learning. And these are the findings. Their feeling of learning, you have active learning, which is in the dark bar, and passive learning in the gray bar. And you can see that students enjoyed the lecture more when it was passive. They felt that they learned a great deal more in that condition. The instructor was more effective at teaching, and they wished that all of their physics classes had been taught, would continue to be taught that way, in that passive environment. Interestingly, though, on the other hand, that when they were tested on their learning, the results were the opposite. The black bar on the right is their test of learning from the active learning environment, and it's significantly higher than the other, about 10% higher. And what this shows us is that we have this mismatch between how we feel we learn best and how we actually learn best. When we are active in our learning processes, we learn best. So sadly, folks, teaching does not equal learning. Probably better put, being taught does not equal learning. We have to take an active role in what we're doing, and there are two ways we can understand why we have this mismatch: nature and nurture. So as you can see, I'm starting with nature and the brain, which takes up 2 to 3% of our body mass, but consumes around 20% of the energy that our body needs. And there are two expensive activities that our brains undertake, and learning something new is one of the most expensive activities for that precious commodity of energy. The other one, not surprisingly, is about moving the body. So it's not surprising that our brains, which have evolved over millennia to conserve energy and save it for when they need it, help us to kind of actively resist being active, if that makes sense. So we have this tape recorder approach to learning where we feel that this engaging lecturer is teaching us very well. We have this illusion of fluency, this illusion of learning, and our brains are not spending nearly as much information. So for me, learning means memory and transfer, or being able to remember content and then apply it or transfer it to different conditions. So when I'm listening to a lecture, I'm thrilled with it, I understand it, but I have an illusion of understanding. And this is my comfort zone on the left, and probably a lot of you have this comfort zone. And to be clear, the direct instruction approach and transmission of information is effective, it is important, but it's not the only thing we need if we want to learn effectively. So I want to go now to nurture and look at another reason why we have this mismatch between how we feel we learn best and how we actually learn best. So we have, in terms of access to knowledge and understanding and information, we started out with a scarcity of access, and we had the knowledge in the hands of the very few who would transmit it, kind of trickle down to the masses. So we had this scarcity mindset when we first started learning from one another. And even when we started to learn to read and write and have literacy, basically, literacy was still held by the powerful. And then the Gutenberg press came along, and we were able to copy and transmit knowledge more easily. But by the 15th century, the die had been cast for formal learning. And universities like Cambridge and Oxford had already formed, and folks were delivering information, much like I am right now, from one to the many. And this is kind of how the die was cast for our learning. If you look in a university classroom today, you'll see the same thing. We have mass production of books. We have information spread through media, such as radio, television, and now the internet. And it's really an abundance of information that we're dealing with, not a scarcity. But we're in this scarcity mindset when we approach learning. So this is me as well. This is my preference. My brain is actually telling me, hey, you're 55, slow down, relax, you don't need to learn new things. At the same time, I'm swimming in this abundance of information and having to manage that. So at age 50, I decided to undertake a doctorate in cognitive science, and my mismatch between how I felt I learned best and how I actually learned best really hit me hard at this point. This is where the rug was pulled out from underneath me. So I've always loved learning. It's my identity. And being a teacher as well, since I was in kindergarten, I thought about how my kindergarten teacher was teaching me. So I have lived and breathed teaching and learning all of my life, but under this scarcity mindset and with my brain trying to conserve energy. And for me, knowledge was the tree of knowledge. And my motto was, if you want the fruit, you have to climb the tree. But my brain was still in tape recorder mode, and I had this illusion of, this professor is wonderful, I'm learning so much. But I was not as active in my learning, and this came crashing down on me, as I said, when I was preparing for my oral comprehensive exams of 2 full years of learning about what my passion was, cognitive science. My advisor said, okay, here's a question for you, a practice exam question. I said, okay. I grabbed my notes. She said, what are you doing? You can't use your notes. This is exam practice. The exam is in 2 weeks. And I was floored. I didn't know how to answer. I had been taking in information dutifully. I had read, I had reread, I had even done some highlighting. I re-listened to all those lectures, but I wasn't applying it. I wasn't doing much with it. I wasn't actively learning. So my advisor gently said to me, look, you know this stuff. I know you know this stuff. It's cognitive science. You just need to apply it to yourself. It's time to apply it to yourself. So I took a deep breath, and in the 2 weeks remaining, I did apply it. And what I've come to see over the years since that happened, the 5 years, is that what I was doing was really learning out loud. And I also realized that teaching does not equal learning, as I said, and we have this mismatch between how we feel we learn best and how we actually learn. But when we are learning actively, we actually have a memory of it, and we're able to apply it generally, or in most cases. So let's look at what learning out loud might look like. And we have this continuum. Notice that we have an arrow at both ends. That means that we always move back and forth between passive and active. And direct instruction and reading are important. We have to take in the information. But I like to think also about internal versus external. And we can learn out loud internally as well. And there's something called the production effect. And what happens with the production effect from Bodner and McLeod is that just by saying a word out loud or mouthing the word, you have a 15% gain in your memory. So you can see the results on the side there. Words that were spoken aloud, that's the black bar, were remembered 15% more than the words that were not spoken. And even mouthing the words makes a difference. So that's part of learning out loud on that internal end. But I'd like you to also think about being a consumer and a prosumer. And prosumer simply means being able to consume and create content, which we all have the capability of. So we still have to take in this information, but we have to stop and think about it. But our working memory is really limited. When we're consciously managing information, we can only manage 3 to 5 elements in our mind. And there's a great quote from a productivity expert and a prolific author named David Allen, who says that our minds are great for having ideas, but not holding ideas. So keep in mind that, yes, we have to stop and think about the information. That's super important to make sense of it. And we make sense of it typically by organizing it. We compare it to information or knowledge that we've had in the past, or we compare it together. We categorize it, we look at similarities and differences, but we think about it. That's the key once we take it in. And it's super important. I may be overemphasizing it, but there's a great quote from cognitive psychologist Daniel Willingham that says, "Memory is the residue of thought," which is kind of poetic to me. But really, we have to stop and think about it, but we also have to be ready to discard and prune information that is no longer serving us. But I'm the one in charge of that. I'm actively making those decisions. But remember, we have this abundance of information. So I like to think about my handy-dandy headlamp. My husband will love this from our camping days. So I use my headlamp to look around the room and to choose the content that is important to me. I focus my attention. So why waste so much energy on holding everything in our minds when we have this environment or environmental supports? And if you want a sexier word for this, it's called your external memory field. And what that is simply the materials around you, including your body, but also pen and paper. Well, I want to tell you about something called the drawing effect. And Juanes, Fernandez, and Mead, who are University of Waterloo researchers in psychology, have examined this with a lot of different sets of university students. So they deliver the information either through a lecture or the students take it in by reading. And in one condition, the students write in words, and including elaboration in their own words. And in the other condition, they add drawing to their words, to their notes, either just drawings alone or words and drawings together. And participants were able to actively recall, not select on a multiple choice question, but actively recall more than twice the number of drawn words than written. So that's the university classroom, but as you can see, I'm interested in the aging population as well. And the same researchers have compared young learners and old learners and found consistent results across the board. But what's most interesting to me is that they've done research with the aging population and people in their late 70s and 80s, some of whom have probable dementia, and they did exactly the same conditions. Participants were able to recall 4 or 5 times the number of words that they had drawn rather than writing in simply words. And those are really compelling results when you think that, of the age group, but also the folks in the living with dementia or probable dementia outperformed the typically aging individuals. So the drawing effect is real, and in my mind, it's about using this external memory field to support my limited working memory to help me to learn and remember. We also have to talk about things. We know very well from the research I shared earlier in the Harvard study that students who work together, even though they didn't enjoy it as much, learned more. And we do this in the workplace. In fact, there's a great TED Talk by John Stepper called Working Out Loud. And he's got this great program going on connecting people all around the world around communities of practice, harnessing this abundance of information, but also resources that are human to learn. We also have technology, digital media, and this is exactly what I've been doing because I teach only online. So this is where I have been working with my students, and I begin in their comfort zone by giving them carefully curated information. Remember, we've got this scarcity mindset, and they want information from the person they're paying to be the expert. And then we begin to use images to share our understanding. So I say, draw the connection between this theory and this process. And I get resistance. Initially, it's about not feeling creative or that they have any drawing skill. And I tell them, look, the research tells us that it doesn't matter. Draw the connections that you understand. So they do this, they engage in this activity, they draw, and then I have them create things like infographics and other digital products and share it within the class. And then eventually, by the end of the course, I have them share more widely, and they're most resistant to that, to going public with their understanding. When outside of the class, they live online, but when it's sharing their learning, they're a bit vulnerable. And I think we can all relate to that. But once they do, they actually get it. They start forming their own learning communities or a personal learning network around their topic of interest. And these are some data. Unfortunately, you can't read it too well from the research I've been doing over the last 2 years of students' experience. And the quote on the left basically emphasizes that this practice of going internally, externally, drawing and sharing our understanding digitally with infographics, combining words and images, helps us to continue to learn about the field that they've chosen and also to develop themselves more outside of the classroom. And the quote on the right indicates, of course, they begin by being frustrated, but it's enabling them to communicate, share knowledge, and spread understanding on topics, which is why we learn, really. And anthropologist Michael Wesch has a great way of looking at the similar work that he does by having his students eventually go digital and public with their understanding. And he says that he's helping his students go from being knowledgeable to knowledge-able. And that's really the secret sauce for me as well. So we have to make changes. And Lewin's change model is really helpful in this respect. And this is a model used in organizations, but I find it helpful for me because this is exactly what I had to do when I was studying for my comprehensive exams. But I had to unfreeze, and it was super uncomfortable for me at my age especially. But then I changed, and I've been working on that change for a long time. But this is how change is affected. And when we really need to innovate, we have to let go of something at the same time. So why am I talking about this model now? Why would this matter? Well, in March 2020, we all had this global unfreezing. Our entire world's changed, and we had to rethink how we study, work, communicate, interact. Our long-held beliefs were challenged, and we now have this opportunity to change. And we paid attention to science, medical science, epidemiology, the CDC, to navigate this mass disruption and to change. But we also have cognitive science, which is also referred to as the science of learning, or what I like to call learning out loud. And that can help us change as well and take advantage of this great disruption and this unfreezing that we've experienced. So as we turn the corner and look ahead, I want to change my initial question, and instead of asking you, how do we learn, I want to ask you, how will we learn? And I want you to think about going from being knowledgeable to knowledge-able and to learn out loud. Thank you.